Hello, my name's Fraser Muggeridge and this is my presentation for my PhD examination at the School of Design at RMIT. I'm at my studio in Bethnal Green, London, where I lead a small team producing graphic design for a global audience. The day-to-day practices of a graphic designer running a studio involves working with a number of people on many different levels who all play a role in the outcome of a piece of work. I'd like to thank all the clients, artists we have worked with, studio staff and print suppliers who over 20 years have supported my practice in so many ways. I owe a great deal of gratitude to my supervisors Brad Haylock and Susie Attiwill, who have helped me with great professionalism and inspiration. The process of this practice-based PhD that involves a series of seminars every 6 months has led me on a journey to enable me to discover, document, understand and expand on what I do. My fellow candidate James Langdon has been a great companion and roommate during these get-togethers. My partner Eleanor von Braun has opened my eyes to many aspects of publishing due to her X marks the box-ship space and has continued to support me at every stage of this PhD in numerous ways. So let's get going. The homepage of my website offers a brief overview and entrance point into my work. How does a graphic designer make decisions when we're all using the same tools and visual references? This research explores and explicates a knowingly wrong approach that fuses traditional mastery, that of knowing, with unconventional techniques, processes and outcomes, that of wrongness, to enable innovation within the discipline. This research offers an alternative approach to how graphic design is made. The title, Knowing Wrongness, Type, Typography, Print and Workmanship Applied in Graphic Design Practice looks at my practice over the last 20 years in the reflective practice model of research. This reflection starts at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication, the University of Reading, in the early 1990s. Here is a student project that I designed, a small, straightforward book set in hot metal and printed at the in-house printing facility in the department. This training, knowledge and experience led to the foundation of my studio design practice concerned with doing things right. Here you see a book designed in 2007 for the Henry Moore Institute that embeds these principles, with the design played out in a well-mannered, reasonable and accomplished way. There has been a shift over the last decade towards a strategy of approach that I have defined as knowingly wrong, employing deliberately unconventional methods to enable design decisions and to produce work that is set apart from the mainstream. My practice has matured into a dialectical relationship with rightness. Explorations in type, typography and printmaking are undertaken, research from historical narrative and immediately implemented as a live laboratory in studio practice. This PhD looks at this unpredictability in all areas of my practice as a way of making design decisions and the creation of new work. Throughout this research, I've discovered and understood key strands of practice, how I know what I know, the strategies, methods and techniques used to create work, and how this is all played out in a London contemporary studio environment. This commitment and study of theoretical and practical activities has formulated a new understanding and a way of approaching graphic design practice, the concept and practical application of knowing wrongness for past and future design practitioners and for those in the academy. Each strand has been interrogated in 3 phases. Firstly, I focused on the context of my research. Then I undertook a deep reflexive analysis of my current and past graphic design work to understand how I know what I know. Lastly, I synthesized the findings of my reflections with existing literature and practices in the field, also documenting and discussing relevant practices within each strand. In addition to this primary reflexive approach, I enjoyed as a secondary method a series of semi-structured interviews with practitioners and experts in the field. These were undertaken and recorded in person or via video call. In these interviews, I asked specific questions that related to my historical research, questions that I felt had not been answered or even asked in the documented literature. These interviews fact-checked theories or stories that I was aware of. The interviews enabled me to complete a review of my practice context and contributed towards a greater understanding of the design methods used in my own practice. These 5 key strands of activities of practice are addressed here in this presentation, starting with type design without designing type. Typography. A dialogue with the press. Sampling and the repository. And the workmanship of risk as design. Together these strands collide to form the drivers that enable me to make decisions and to make the work. Type design without designing type. Here I looked at the unconventional methods that I have developed that enable me to produce type to use in my practice. I am very much a typographer, experienced in skills at using type, and have developed an eye to look at type, to understand its nuances and to make key decisions in my practice. I am not a trained type designer, so do not possess the technical knowledge, skills or patience to draw type from scratch. So I've developed a unique method of type designing without designing type. These are played out in 3 main ways. The manipulation of existing fonts using type software in unconventional ways, using and abusing parametric typeface design software, and repurposing computer programs intended for other uses. A pivotal moment was in 2013 with a commission to produce an invitation for an exhibition of Philip Allen's paintings, but without using images as they hadn't been completed. I thought I could produce this invite using letterpress type held at Camberwell College of Art where I was teaching at the time. I specified 11 and 14-point univers, and when the physical proof was sent to me, as shown here, the uppercase L's in the word Allen had been substituted for X's as there were no uppercase L's in the tray of this font of this size. This is one of the constraints of letterpress. If the letters are not in the type case, there is nothing that can be done. I was faced with 2 options, to use Univers Bold or Grotesque 215, a similar typeface that had enough characters to make up the title. I was against using bold as this would have created a second layer of differentiation, and one principle fed down to me at Reading was to use one level of hierarchy where possible. The idea of mixing 2 typefaces that are relatively similar would have not been something I would ever considered in normal circumstances, but due to the physical constraints set against me, I gave the go-ahead to set the uppercase in grotesque. To the untrained eye, this would not have been noticeable at such a small size and was not mentioned to the client or the artist. Production limitations generated this creative solution, and this job gave me the idea to mix fonts together that were similar in form and weight, but on the computer with ease and without technical constraints. I used a mix of copperplate Gothic in uppercase and Fournier in lowercase in a booklet, Mistaken Presence, in 2013, that combined 2 typefaces at the opposite ends of the typographic spectrum. Again, these differences were subtle, that while I would not even make the client aware of this method was quick and easy, and a way of creating new fonts from existing fonts. The next logical step in this development was to increase the number of fonts into one Megafont. 26 upper and 26 lowercase letters were selected from 52 different fonts that were similar in shape and form of a grotesque sans serif typeface. The selection of the fonts was crucial, different enough but not too different that it was too noticeable. I wanted to avoid a punk-like or ransom note graphic effect. Megafont was made by opening the selected fonts in FontLab, then cutting and pasting each letter into a new font file, then scaling to a uniform X height. I enjoy that the use of megafonts cuts down the choice that a designer must make between all these fonts, when they can all be used. Clients are receptive to this idea and the story and are open to the many references and elements that are not specific to one font or one idea. The notion of difference and variation is embraced, fitting for today's cultural climate. Megafont was originally made for the publication Manarg by David Berridge, described as a jumble exercise in reading about writing and writing about reading. The contextual alternate feature in design software allows a different version of a letter to be set depending on what character precedes or follows. This is applied in script fonts to predict multiple combinations of ligatures so the letters are joined together automatically. I use this function but in an unconventional way, to combine 26 different fonts, this time's versions of Century Schoolbook, to cycle between all 26 variations. This meant that every time a letter was set, it would be in a different font, shown here with the different letter I's. These typefaces and their various iterations and reincarnations bring a certain unequal, uneven, and unresolved texture when used. A wrongness, a flicker on the page reminiscent of letterpress printing with all its faults and misprints. It seems that the text has been poorly set and badly printed. A key part of this research has been looking into the history of typefaces that consist of more than one typeface. This is the record cover for All Is Now by Section 25, designed by the British graphic designer Peter Saville in 1981, that features a typographic pastiche of a Berthold type specimen. In an interview, Saville recalled how he ordered Bembo display type from a local photo typesetting company based on the Edgware Road in London, that unknown to him had an incorrect lowercase g and h from a different typeface, that of Baskerville. This wrongness was not the designer's intention but the type manufacturer's mistake. It had somehow become embedded in the font. You can see Baskerville on the right has an open bowl and a more rounded H than Bembo on the left. In my research, I tracked the historic examples of the wrong characters in physical type specimens, seen here in PhotoScript in 1968 at St Bride's Printing Library in London, Agency Alphabets from 1970, and Visual Graphics International from 1972. And not surprisingly, the results have gone straight into practice. In September 2020, I designed an issue of Art Monthly with a new digital remake of this typeface with the mistakes put back in, to the G and to the H, and seen here under the loop magnifier. And a record cover with a G from a different font from the main text of the record, Living in a Land by Sean Aston. The main reason for my interest in this story is about mistakes and how these can either be intentional or unintentional, and how these can add to the design and can tell a story that can be retold by designers. The wrongness in the Bembo font is so subtle, you wouldn't necessarily notice it unless you know the inner characteristics of each typeface. The book Mr. Valiant for Truth, that I showed earlier, designed as a student in 1995, was set on a hot metal keyboard in 9-point Baskerville and corrected by hand, so I spent a lot of time looking and literally physically holding this typeface. Another method I have developed is type hacking, that of altering the letter forms or parts of the letter forms themselves. Radical Essex was created by turning the points on the curve of Helvetica from round to straight. Writing and Illuminating and Lettering by Edward Johnston talks about the essential or skeleton form of a letter. Online type design software such as Prototypo uses this as the same basic form for their typefaces. I performed some experiments by redrawing the skeleton of existing fonts. Here's Accident Grotesque, which I wanted to get back to the essential form. I was interested in erasing the human alterations that have been made to these typefaces. The magenta line is exactly the halfway point of the letter. You will see that the baseline is not even due to the strict imposed rule of drawing at the halfway point of each letter and not making any corrections. This skeleton form can then be given weight to produce any desired instance. As this font exists as a line skeleton, additional simple actions can be performed, such as applying the offset curve function the wrong way in glyphs, whose intended role is to smoothly expand a curve to generate an even weight. Here I used it to move skeletal points to alter the curve, again applied with the contextual alternate characters if you look at the 3 different Cs. This was moved forward even further with Seismic, a skeleton font designed in Latin and Bangla, which was test drove at the Dakar Art Summit of 2020 in Bangladesh. This variable font of both weight and seismicness is due for release in collaboration with Universal Thirst Type Foundry in 2022. In 2015, I worked with the artist Fiona Banner in creating a typeface by using software in an unconventional way, constructed from a blend of all the typefaces that she uses. Font was produced using the interpolation type tool in design software, which blends values of different weights of the same font to create the in-between weights. Using the software intentionally wrong by blending a serif typeface with a sans serif typeface, then again with a free font, produced a new bastard form of aesthetic ugliness. It was important not to correct any of the forms made through the process. The T that crashes into the next character, the G that remains uninterpolated due to the software limitations, are all victims of the wrong way that I am using it. Banner uses font as her house font, as seen here in an exhibition at the Libby Leschgold Gallery in Vancouver in 2019. Font is downloadable from her website, presented as an artwork. This watercolour robot drawing machine, the Watercolour Bot, paints in watercolour any image that is fed into the software. The only requirement being it has to be vectorised so the brush can follow some form of XY path. As opposed to Adobe Illustrator that creates a series of separate auto trace lines, its software StippleGen maps a continuous line for the robot brush to use based on the travelling salesman problem of working out the shortest route between a number of points. There are numerous solutions and routes for each image. Each time I fed an image into the software, a slightly different path would be drawn, so I wondered what would happen if you apply this to letter forms. The software is creating a continuous path that is also drawing the letter A in many different ways. I had set up the conditions and the software was creating the variations. These letters can be saved as vectors, then imported into type design software as contextual alternates that can be used to create a working typeface. Shonky, the aesthetics of awkwardness, combines a knowingly wrong approach in both letter form and form. 16 fonts were designed with the online font tool Prototypo using parametric sliders that affect all the letters as opposed to one. Rather like pushing all the controls on a music mixing desk to their extreme to create a distorted sound. You can see this as the sliders turn red to indicate this. Each typeface is distorted within a different parameter of curviness, serif width, or serif arc. This was executed in the publication with each paragraph cycling through each iteration of the typeface variation.
This form of creating typefaces without designing each letter from scratch can bring about multiple variants relatively quickly and efficiently as an economical means of production. I make these moves to be different, to be wrong, but with all the knowledge of type from its history to theory and current contemporary manifestations. Type design is not my principal occupation, but I have the eye and knowledge to interrupt this discipline in an unconventional way. From type moving to typography, which is the next strand. Early in my undergraduate course at Reading, Professor Michael Twyman gave a lecture, Typography Without Words, that used a simple notation to teach the graphic variables and basic hierarchy of typography. Through examples of different combinations of lines using X and 0 with varying space, typography was simplified into an abstract graphic form and began to make sense to me. This example shows the many different ways headings can be differentiated from main text. This grounding in typographic principles comes from an understanding of the relationship between type size, line length, and leading, demonstrated in the dimensional relationships in the composition of text, published in the Stafford Papers in the 1970s, that compares the same piece of text set at the same size, but with different line lengths and different leadings. I could immediately see the effect that each variable had on each other. The longer the line length, the more leading required. These two theories have stayed with me all these years, and I refer back to them daily in my practice, looking, seeing, and knowing what decisions to make. Typesetting, in particular that of contextual indent paragraph setting, where the end of a paragraph has a relationship to that of the paragraph below, was the section of study here. In 2013, my partner Eleanor von Braun showed me a handful of small publications written and designed by Paul Buck in 1976. This was on display with other books on experimental writing and performance at her bookshop space, X Marks the Box Ship in London. Very soon after, in June 2013, I worked on a small booklet with the artist Cathy Haynes for her residency at UCL in London. This journey of time was represented through typography with the use of a form of paragraph indent that relates to where the previous paragraph ended, to create a continuous flow of text, following the same system as Lust. This was possible for two reasons: my positive relationship with the client and the small-scale nature of publication that enabled the actual manual typesetting production of this design. I've become more and more fascinated by this type of setting, thinking that it might be possible to create a way to perform this task automatically as a plugin or script in InDesign. Why is it not there already? What needs to happen is the computer needs to measure the length of the last line and apply this as an indent. I worked with our in-house web developer Simon Rogers in applying a codec logic to this problem. This script can be imported into InDesign to perform the task when the script is run. I implemented this script immediately into a live project, a book for the architects Sturm and Wartschlag in 2020. My research has led me on a typographic hunt for examples of setting, which I document in the dissertation, the majority coming from poetry, music, or experimental writing. The layout of the Future of Music credo found in the book Silence by John Cage relates each parallel text vertically, so it is flagged to the reader that the text set in uppercase can be read independently as well as together, with the in-between texts that are set in uppercase and lowercase. The text is not one long text, but two separate texts. The book jacket for Exercises in Style, designed by Stephen Themerson, uses the same type of typesetting, a slight variation from his internal vertical justification put forward in 1949 as an attempt to make type arrangement more diagrammatic, more planar than linear, and more comprehensible. The paste-up artwork reveals that the type has been set solid in letterpress, then manually cut up and moved down a line to be photographed, then printed in offset lithography. A dialogue with the press focuses on my development of analog printing techniques, predominantly interfering with offset lithography as a creative process. The purpose for this is to find new combinations of design and production techniques that can visually inform the design from a knowingly wrong standpoint. The experimentation, refinement and repetition of a particular technique is unique to me in my practice and separates my work from that of the rest of the field of contemporary design. Historical examples have not been well documented. My research led me to its roots with Eugene Feldman, an American printer and experimental printmaker who used the offset press for his creative print experiments and for his commercial activity in the 1960s in America. I quote, "Craft and commerce are not separate but united in purpose. Business was my gateway to art, and art is part of my business." I believe that machines, the offset press as much as the hand press, are no more worthy of respect than any other tool that comes between the artist's mind and his work. He referred to the offset press as his brush and the paper as his canvas, and described his work as painting with the press. I have developed an understanding of rotary offset lithography, primarily as it's the print process that produces 95% of my printed matter output. I always enjoy the excitement of a press check, watching the press operator preparing the job with make-ready sheets, adjusting levels on press, mixing ink and even washing up. It still feels like magic how a plate, paper and ink mix in layers to create a multitude of text, image and colour. I would ask printers I work with if they could facilitate experiments on the press to create abstract images through making from scratch, using mine and theirs knowledge of the press, to give up a certain amount of certainty, to introduce elements of chance and wrongness. This exploration started in 2015 with a workshop I led at the Bauhaus in Weimar that had a working print department at the university. I made printing plates with the use of chemicals and the physical process of washing out the printing plate, so the areas that weren't washed out would form an image without knowing how this would appear until printing. The first opportunity to interact and interrupt an offset lithography press while it was running came at L'Automatica, a design and print collective from Barcelona. I printed with multiple split duct colours, placed blobs of ink directly on the rollers and squirted water and gas into the rollers, a technique borrowed from printers using to wash up the press. This printing session occurred during candidature of this PhD, coincided with a practice research symposium in Barcelona, and the prints made was informed by my prior reflective work. This pivotal work, free from education or client's brief, continued to inform further sessions in other places. I was prepared to let natural forces occur and accidental effects, produced by the machine, but interfered with through my actions. An invitation in 2017 from the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in Manila, in the Philippines, offered another opportunity to test out some new ideas that I had had since Barcelona. Specifically, the use of deletion pens and deletion wax, which are used to remove areas on a plate. Dipping gloves into developer and pressing on the plate became a communal, collaborative, almost performative act with teacher, printer and workshop participants all working together to create an image. The plate that is in turn printed. Offset printing normally is the stage that makes an identical copy, a consistent form of high-speed duplication through a commercial print process. I'm using my knowledge of printing gained through vast experience of going to printers to conduct press passes, to play and push the parameters that these machines can offer and produce work that is not identical in every print. I was given the opportunity to work with an offset printer in Bangladesh as part of the Dhaka Art Summit in 2018. I worked again on the technique of trying to create images without any preconceived artwork by turning used plates around and applying interruptive techniques. Bangladesh offered more opportunities for working on wrongness as the presses were older and smaller in size, with the printers more used to manual interventions on the press. They're usually trying to solve printing inconsistencies rather than trying to create them. I could create giant hickeys by positioning the dead skin layer of ink directly onto the impression cylinder. I enjoyed the large white halos that resulted, a glow or drop shadow effect, and it felt for the first time that I had created an original image. This was used 2 years later in 2020 for the identity and graphics for the subsequent Dhaka Art Summit in Dhaka in Bangladesh, alongside the seismic font that was shown earlier. A month-long residency at the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver in October 2018 offered up the opportunity of printmaking both on an offset lithographic press and a flat-blade lithographic press. They share the same basic principle, the repulsion of oil and water, but work in different ways. Offset lithography is extremely fast, with stone or flatbed lithography being extremely slow. I was interested in going between each machine and trying to merge or bounce the same ideas and techniques on each to see what would happen. I was able to work with Ryan Smith, who runs Brick Press, a small offset print shop in the heart of Chinatown, with a series of experiments of putting hair cut from both of our scalps straight onto the press, as shown in A, throwing hole punch circular offcuts into the press that are created when a plate is hole punched to enable it to be fixed to the press, and that's in C, and throwing a glove into the press, shown in D. An exhibition at the print shop showed the prints and the press and the tools and the materials used to make the work. Print sessions at the Emily Carr Institute using the hand-fed litho machine offered possibilities of inking and printing with cellophane, a material that was lying around the studio used to cover ink pots to prevent ink from drying out. I felt liberated by working with cellophane, the anticipation, the printing, the analysis of what could be done better next time. Variation could be applied by how tight or how loose the cellophane was when inked, and it would form some form of crack. It was a laborious process. Each print took 1 hour to make, so after a while I thought, let's just wrap up the whole plate in cellophane and ink that and print that. This seemed like a real technique that could be controlled to a certain degree and would give variation. The amount of ink, how this is applied, the size of the roller, the direction of the cellophane wrap would all have an effect on the print. I've learned to trust the process and not to try and fix these imperfections that most other graphic designers would. Photoshop is an amazing tool where anything is literally possible in the manipulation of images, but it's precisely this fact that it doesn't offer any creative solutions for my work. Throughout this PhD, graphic image making through printmaking has become an important aspect of my practice, produced through DIY print processes, traditional printmaking techniques, and rotary offset lithography as an active wet studio. Certain elements can be lifted from the thought and process of printmaking to become useful tools for the graphic designer. It's a dialogue with the press through a subversion of print media and the development of a particular technique. I use sampling in my practice through borrowing specific elements from unknown or unexpected sources. This allows me to produce work that appears novel, but crucially it enables me to make decisions and to justify these decisions to myself and my clients. I also borrow, sample and lift work from my own practice that I define as self-sampling. Here is my studio again with my ever-developing collection or repository comprising of three main areas. Those relating to type specimen, lettering guides and alphabet collections. Those relating to publication making by non-practicing graphic designers. And those where one aspect, whether it's binding, colour, printing process or arrangement, is of a particular interest. Each of these categories is one step removed from graphic design. They are artifacts not known, recognised or valued for their contribution to graphic design. This collection is a treasure trove of original material that I can absorb and sample certain elements in my practice when appropriate to do so. The collection is embedded in my practice, the act of collecting, the knowledge gained from this collection, and the ability to use strands of the collection where applicable to a commercial job. I conceived and curated the exhibition Towards an Alternative History of Graphic Design at the Delaware Pavilion in 2015, which looked at my material from my repository with the aim to draw out some common threads and key figures. The exhibition set out an alternative way at looking at graphic design history by focusing on 4 publications from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s, designed by individuals and groups with no formal training of typography, graphic design or print production. I curated a section of the 28th International Biennale of Graphic Design in Brno in 2018, where I displayed 13 publications from my repository that I had used as a basis to create new work alongside the resulting design product. I separated out these strands into specific and describable parts to make visible my process of sampling and remixing. The left-hand image is the original source, where I might take one element, here the type of fold, or the print processing, helifor engraving on the left and my design on the right, or a particular lettering style reused for a pop star's record cover. In my historical research, I discussed William Sandberg's reuse of existing graphic elements primarily as an economic consideration. The poster produced for an exhibition by Henry Moore in 1950 at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam reused image blocks made for relief printing that were made for the catalogues. Another Stedelijk poster from 1959 sampled a completely different poster. For the exhibition Form and Waste and Chance, Sandberg and fellow designer Peter Brattinger utilised the partly printed waste make-ready sheets from a poster designed by Rek Dershken that was being produced at the same printer. They created their own Form and Waste and Chance, with only one new additional printing plate being made for the exhibition information. The form is driven from the making process as opposed to how it looked visually. Embracing the mechanical paste-up, graphic designer Neville Brody created a novel self-sampled version of his own work in the Face magazine. The February 1985 article on Madonna used a large uppercase M from one of his own typefaces. In the following issue, a feature on Andy Warhol, Brody sampled the exact physical artwork from the previous issue and turned it upside down to create the W. Cleverly also reproducing part of the Madonna image and the byline to emphasize the original source, shown here in red. In 2010, I was invited to exhibit my design publications at Collide, a small artist book space in London. Part of the requirement was to create an artist book, a daunting task for me at the time. Through the process of trying to design this publication, it soon became apparent that a catalogue showing images of books I had designed would be a poor representation of the work, not the actual work. A solution was to physically take apart 48 different books that I had designed, returning them to 4-page leaves and rebinding them together with all the pages in a different order to create 48 new books. The installation of these 48 books was paired with empty covers that once housed the inside pages of the original books. This began the idea that my work is essentially the work I produce for other people, and I am able to use this in my work as my work. It's actual content that can be taken apart and repurposed for a different purpose. A commercial practice job that uses multi-self-sampling starts with a proposed logo for 21, a new art space in Southend in 2018, run by a long-standing client, Focal Point Gallery. I was trying to create a picture puzzle by combining 20 and 1, but I'm the first to admit that it doesn't really work as an identity. I couldn't help thinking that it was a poor imitation of the IBM logo designed by Paul Rand. The actual space was imminently opening, and I was tasked in producing the health and safety vinyl to stop people walking from straight into the glass windows. So I broke up the forms and rearranged them on the window within the strict guidelines. This worked well, but I still didn't have a sign above the space, as I couldn't face using the original logo. So for a couple of weeks we had a space without a sign and a logo. The same elements at the same size were then reconfigured and remade back to Futura, spelling out the name 21 in Focal Point Gallery's house font, to form the Perspex sign. The original logo could now be abandoned. The leftover material for each colour led to the next reuse, printed in a different process, that of letterpress. Single colour prints were made with the same acrylic colour. I am drawn to the composition of elements that the sign maker prepared by planning the shapes together in an efficient way. I would never make a composition like this. It's like giving something to someone and getting back the byproduct, then making something out of the leftovers that can be better than the original. This reuse and sampling comes from a frugality of upbringing transferred into my practice. Sandberg's work with the Stedelijk would do this based out of necessity and economy with the reuse of printing blocks. We now live in a throwaway graphic design society. It's uneconomical and inefficient to do these types of things as it takes more time and more effort, but I use this as a way of producing constraints to be creative within and self-sampling as a concept in itself. Workmanship, the degree of skill with which a product is made or a job done, plays a key role in my practice as I am making a product and responsible for that product. Before 2010, my work would fall under the description of the workmanship of certainty, as described by David Pye in The Nature and Art of Workmanship, when the result and quality of the result is exactly predetermined before a single thing is made through industrial production. Throughout this PhD process, I've shifted to a workmanship of risk. The workmanship of risk utilises any kind of technique or system in which the quality of the result is not predetermined, but depends on the judgment, dexterity and care which the maker exercises as he works. Malcolm McLaugh wrote, "To craft means to participate skillfully in some small-scale process. And to craft is to care. Some might describe a piece of typography as well crafted, implying that the designers really cared about what they are doing, spent time and energy, and possessed a set of skills to execute the work. This reliance on craft and workmanship is why I don't win many pitches for new business, as it's hard to visualize ideas and explain my craft before I start." Pye notes that design can be conveyed in words and by drawing, workmanship is for what practical purposes cannot. In 2019, I was commissioned by the British indie band Hot Chip to design the cover and associated marketing material for their record, A Bath Full of Ecstasy. The project is an example of all strands of my practice coming together with the use of an unusual, inappropriate yet appropriate typography combined with a unique printmaking technique under the banner of the workmanship of risk. I will look at this here in more detail. Starting with the type, or should I say lettering, A History of Lettering by Nicolette Gray was on the reading list given to me at Reading University and has been on my shelf ever since. It looks at the development of lettering through the centuries, with one particular example by the German artist Max Klinger from 1902 that I've been curious about for a number of years. Further research shows similar letter forms enough to piece together the letters required. Using the lettering for the cover design looked pretty good just straight out of the tin, with the spacing out of the O and F adding a little mystical triangle, a reference to the pyramid stayed at Glastonbury where they would be performing. This typography took 5 minutes to make, but took a whole career manifesting in my head, using my experience and knowledge gained to make decisions. Partly it was done so quickly as the deadline was immediate, so literally I don't have enough time to do multiple options or question or even analyse and refine my work. But I thrive on this form of risk. The imagery for the cover was created through the development and mastering of a roller print technique that used white spirit flicked onto a roller and a paper before rolling that would act as a form of resist when moved over the paper. I could produce prints that had a form of consistency but were all different to each other depending on controllable variables: the amount of ink, white spirit, where it was applied and at what speed. A number of varying prints with different effects were produced with a controlled sense of randomness, with a design being made through the process. Here is a really slow one with only a little white spirit. Each iteration was open to some form of risk of failure and variation, as opposed to the workmanship of certainty of design precision, made on a computer and printed out through an industrial process of identical copies. To develop the typography, I revisited a feature specific to lettering, that of nesting letters within letters to enable even spacing, seen again here in the history of lettering. I've always enjoyed letters that have to change and adapt to the surroundings, such as lack of space. The words on handwritten postcards that get smaller or go around the corner when space is short. Both stone carving and handwriting are examples of the workmanship of risk, but type and typography are based on certainty, with each letter being the same. I aim to create a workmanship of risk within the typography. To enable this, I designed the series of announcements as if it was lettering, made possible as the type I'd created was derived from lettering. I evoked the feeling of the handmade with unpredictability and the workmanship of risk, intentionally setting up a problematic solution with the type not fitting. Then I used creative manual-like methods to solve the problem. As well as nesting, these examples use the running out of space on a postcard method. I would place the type down the side of the design or condense the width taken up by a word using a series of baseline shifts. Awkward breaking of words would also feature as part of this design. These announcements are so specific to each piece of text, precise and bespoke, and address the problem of finding an innovative, inconsistent solution that overall feels coherent. This has become a real trait in my practice. Other designers would simply make the type smaller, but it's a stronger decision to keep all the text the same size and then try and make it fit in different ways. I proposed an overprinted version of all of these individual announcements as the initial tour poster for use on social media as a typographic solution, moving from text back to image. The image purely focused on communicating a feeling. Overprinting is a physical activity loved by designers throughout history as an economical way of creating extra colours, but in this instance it's black printed over black. This design has been made through the process of making and then applied to a commercial job. This was further explored in the limited edition with all the content from the different elements of the record brought to the front. The back cover, the inner sleeve notes, the physical labels, all overprinted together, becoming an illegible design but acting as a readable image. I imagined that the album artwork would look amazing, cut up and put together as clothes for the band to wear on stage. I worked with a pattern cutter craftsperson to make the garments. I specified the design just enough so that I knew approximately what the result would be, while giving her enough freedom in the composition of all elements of the clothes to give the impression that they were just made up from offcuts found at the printers. Pi describes the difference between a skilled system, a process that requires skill for making things, as opposed to a determining system with the constraint being mechanical. The pattern cutter is skilled, making clothes by hand, and I put my trust in her ability to deliver the product rather than specifying exactly what I wanted, which I could have done with digitally printed patterns. This project comprised of multiple outcomes that were in turn designed and improvised as the project developed. As I work through a process in this way, I'm at my most comfortable in making decisions and modifications. Being able to sample and remix elements, taking the design apart and remaking it in different print processes, intentionally working with the workmanship of risk and the workmanship of certainty. Even though the process might seem efficient on the surface, for me it forces swift decision making, it's impulsive and it gets done. So to recap the 5 strands of practice. In the realm of type design, the creation of bespoke wrong typefaces made from using and abusing parametric typeface design software. The manipulation of existing fonts using type design software in unconventional ways and employing programs that are intended for other uses gives me the unique ingredients to shape and form others' messages through typographic application. My knowingly wrong approach to typography is exemplified by contextual indent paragraph setting. My research into the history and use of form of this typesetting that I don't claim to have invented, but which I have introduced into contemporary practice, has been documented here to offer new knowledge in ways to typeset text. I've developed a computer script that can be run in current page layout software to automatically perform this task. An interruption and exploitation print production, in particular the limitations and opportunities presented by offset lithography as an integral part of my design process, creates work that doesn't completely rely on the WYSIWYG control of visual aesthetics. The physical act of printing and experimenting within this, both controlled, knowing, and uncontrolled wrongness, draws together the discipline of graphic design with contemporary printmaking. Sampling from the repository helps me to situate myself outside the mainstream of graphic design. I borrow and remix certain features of these practice specimens that are not widely known or documented in order to make the quick decisions necessary in the fast-paced studio environment where I need to work on multiple jobs simultaneously. Self-sampling elements of my previous works gives me agency as author and originator. I've come to understand that my design practice is characterized today by a workmanship of risk, which stands in stark contrast to the working processes of the majority of graphic designers today. Planning, testing, consistency and precision in the production of multiple identical copies of printed matter, which is the norm for most graphic design today, is thus challenged through an application of risk blended with craft and being involved in the production process in a hands-on way, and using the production process itself as a site of creative practice. This reflective practice research, conducted into and through my practice, has helped me interrogate my graphic design work that combines a classic approach to typography with a workmanship of risk, a synthesis that I describe as knowingly wrong approach. This process has enabled me to understand why I do what I do and how I do it, and has led to an amplification through my practice of this specific approach. I have developed a mature and nuanced approach to typography and print production, built on tacit and implicit knowledge, acquired through a refinement of my design process. During 20 years of practice and over 2,500 jobs completed, I have trained my eye to look at a piece of typography and know exactly what I need to do to move forward. This saves time in decision making and allows me to work on multiple jobs at the same time. Each project is in part unique, yet certain common threads run throughout my work, which I have unearthed by way of this research. My knowing how to do things in a classically right way has shifted over the last decade to become what I now understand as knowingly wrong approach, a way of doing things right and wrong at the same time, often on the same page. I am now in a dialectical relationship with rightness. The concept of knowing wrongness, as evidenced in my own work, is the key contribution that this research makes to graphic design, scholarship and practice.